Good evening, Bistro fans. Jill and Dr. Cole here tonight with another animal chiropractic chat. So we hope everyone's having a splendid Monday. Thank you, Dr. Cole, for joining.
Happy to be here.
Yes. So over the last couple weeks, we've learned about Advanced Animal Chiropractic and how you and Dr. Tully got started. So tonight you have a little friend behind you. Why don't you tell us about your crew at home?
Oh, Lord. Well, we have 3 dogs. They're all boys, and they're all rescues. So that is Slinky right there.
He's got like a pink eye going on.
I know. He's looking outside. He's protecting this house. He is actually, we rescued him at actually one of your events, if you'll recall. Grant and I came to help you guys out, pass out some information at a rescue event that'll be, 2 years ago this fall?
Yeah.
And you know how that goes. We just happened to be wandering around passing out brochures and saw this little devil.
And I fell in love with that little dude.
Fell in love with him real quick. So he came home. And then we have Mowgli, who's my first rescue. He's actually the first dog I ever adjusted because I rescued him in Kansas during my program. And I maybe jumped the gun a bit because I heard another family was interested in him, even though I had promised my mom I'd wait at the end of the program to adopt him. I was like, no, he needs to be mine, which is probably a good thing because he really doesn't like kids, and that family had a lot of kids. So it was maybe meant to be. And then we have Pongo, who is our I-75 special. He was found in a box with 2 other puppies on I-75 in Ohio. Wow. And we just took him in, even though, again, my mom's involved in all of this. She didn't think we needed another dog when we only had Mowgli. And yet she kept sending me pictures of dogs that needed to be adopted. So she's the one I have to thank for that. But yeah, we've got all boys. We have a Disney theme in our household. We've got Mowgli, Pongo, and Slinky Dog. I used to have a fish named Rafiki, but he was killed by another fish named Prince Sashimi. So it's just, we've got a very fun family around here. And, most of the time they get along, but a lot of our posts, if people follow our page, tend to be, if it has anything related to our business, most of the time it's probably a picture of one of our dogs.
And they're all hounds of some sort.
Yeah, they're all hounds. So Slinky is actually, we did the DNA test thing last Christmas, and lo and behold, our little beagle back there is 100% beagle, even though he doesn't look like it. He's a blue tick beagle, which is super common down south. Mm-hmm. And then Mowgli, we don't agree with his DNA results. It said he's like Cocker Spaniel, which he definitely isn't. So he's another hound. He looks a lot like a Jack Russell Terrier, just on stilts, and he has a beard. And then you've got Pongo, who's like a pointer cattle dog, golden Brittany mix. Who knows? A little bit. They're all hounds. Apparently, we're hound people. Who knew?
They all have the hound vocalization.
They do. They definitely do. Slinky for sure. The beagle definitely. He loves the day, which hopefully you guys won't hear it tonight since it's a hot day. So a lot of people are going to be walking by.
Oh my goodness. Too much fun. Awesome. Thank you for telling us about your house. Everyone wants to know who you live with. All right. So tonight so last week we covered the hips. We're just going to kind of stay in that area tonight. We're going to talk about the sacrum. So I guess first to start off, what is and where is the sacrum? I don't know if a lot of people know where that's located or what it entails.
Sure. So your sacrum, by like layman's terms, is usually referred to as your tailbone. You've got the very bottom of your sacrum has what's called the coccyx, and that's usually what people refer to when they say they've landed on their tailbone or hurt something down there. So usually that's kind of the easiest way to describe it. It's basically this triangular shaped bone in between your pelvic bones. So it's part of the pelvic, the pelvis in general, but it's kind of like the middle guy. It's like this shape, and it's got both of your hip joints on either side. So people kind of don't realize how important that bone is. And it's basically this triangular shaped bone that's technically 4 bones fused into one. So it kind of looks like a piece of pizza, and it curves in a little bit too. So it's kind of got like this C shape like that. but yeah, it's a super important area of your spine. And kind of like we talked about a few weeks ago about sympathetics and parasympathetics, it's part of the parasympathetics. So it's part of that rest and digest part of your body. So a lot of times when people have issues with their sacrum, it has to do with anything dealing with the, your rest and digest, your digestion of food, like all that jazz. And if we adjust it, you'll oftentimes see things related to bowel and bladder coming up.
And it's sensitive. I remember having an injury as a child trying to do some sort of trick on my bicycle.
Yeah. Oh yeah. It's an easy one to fall on.
Yeah, it's not fun.
No. A lot of people have bruised tailbones. It's not a pleasant experience.
Good. And so then even from there though, so even past for our animals, we don't have this, but for our animals, our cats and dogs, even past the sacrum, we still have some additional bones that actually create the tail. So
yeah, so it's the same actually that humans, we just have it's like an additional little triangle at the bottom of your sacrum that's called your coccyx. In animals, it becomes like the coccygeal segments. So you basically they have a few more than us, obviously, but they're not all fused together, they're lengthened. So that's how you have the tail. And it's really interesting, like different breeds have very different shapes of that sort of thing. And you can kind of look at, like when you look at cat breeds, you've got like the Manx cat who pretty much doesn't have a tail and it ends right there, and similar things with like the bulldog. Like look at those guys. And a lot of times they have a lot of issues with bowel and bladder. And a lot of it, I think, has to do with just the way they're shaped,
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. That makes a lot of sense too. So along with the sacrum, so, like you said, the sacrum can sometimes, it's a C shape, but sometimes it gets locked there. And that happens from injuries or falls or roughhousing or, anything. Good Lord knows a myriad of things can happen with our pets. So during a chiropractic appointment, you actually adjust the sacrum.
Sure. Yeah. So there's not nearly as much movement in the sacrum as your other joints throughout your spine, but there's enough that if you have lack of mobility there, it can affect both the hips and it can affect your lower lumbars, which then in turn affects all those nerves that are exiting that region. So it's a highly innervated area, which I don't think a lot of people realize. So like going down to your back legs and again, bowel and bladder, all of those sorts of things are really controlled. And that's kind of like their central area of where the messages are coming from. So if you have an locked up sacrum or locked up tailbone or something's jammed there, a lot of times you're going to have issues with back end.
Totally makes sense. So two of the main issues that come up that we see a lot when the sacrum is locked or not moving correctly is incontinence as well as constipation. So why don't we go down the incontinence road and talk a little bit about how chiropractic can be beneficial for issues of incontinence and how that is. I would say incontinence I've seen more in dogs than cats, but I have seen it with cats. So
yeah. It's interesting. So we have to do a little bit of background on incontinence in general. So just for specification, incontinence is a situation where you cannot control and you're not aware of your bowel and bladder. It means you're leaking urine or your inability to constrict and hold in your bowels, that sort of thing. So that's kind of what we're talking about. So it can really affect animals of all ages. And this is across the board. Cats, dogs, bunnies, you name it, can be a little bit of anything. Horses deal with it too. You're just not really as aware because it's not like they're in your homes. So you're noticing them lose control of their bowel and bladder. They pretty much just go when they need to go. But yeah, it's obviously super noticeable when it's your pet and they're living in your home and you're stepping in poop or you're finding urine throughout your house. I would say that with dogs, you tend to see a little bit more of the bowel of that sort of, the bowel part of the incontinence, especially when they're elderly. Whereas the urine a lot of times tends to be, at least in what I've experienced, it can tend to affect younger animals because of an injury or like we were talking about, they play really hard. Jumpers are really prone to issues with incontinence just because they can land on their tailbone. They're not very graceful. And if you do that repeatedly, think of like a pogo stick and you're just constantly hitting that same region. Like eventually that's going to be very difficult to move and pretty locked up. So there's a couple different theories behind what kind of incontinence you might have. So there's spay incontinence, which we can dive into a different day. But a lot of times when it's a risk that you take when you go and get your female cat or dog spayed, that you might have a nick in that pudendal nerve, which controls, contraction and relaxation of the sphincters. So a lot of times after dogs get spayed, there's a chance that you might get a little bit of leaking, which is really unfortunate because you have these very young, a lot of times, 6 months and under dogs that now for the rest of their life are going to have issues with that, or they'll be put on medication for the rest of their life. So that's something that I always tell people, especially if it doesn't happen directly after a spay, it's not a bad idea to at least get them checked out to make sure the sacrum's doing well post-adjust or post-surgery, because a lot of times it can just be, it's a very awkward position for your pet to be in during a spay for an extended period of time. And if that aggravates the sacrum, then that could be the reason you're seeing a little bit of incontinence as opposed to actually having that nerve been nicked. So always good to kind of rule that out. In addition, one thing that we see a ton in our practice is senior dogs. Senior dogs having trouble with urine, having trouble with bowels, all that sort of thing. A lot of times it's directly related to arthritis, disc disease, a whole myriad of things, obviously. But again, that's something that a lot of times we can really help through chiropractic, or at least kind of decrease the frequency with which it's happening. And it's one of those things where it's kind of a case-by-case basis. But it's pretty cool to see how all these animals respond. Sometimes it's a result of just straight neurological damage, whether that be, your pet had a stroke or they've been hit by a car or anything that could actually damage the spinal cord. And to kind of go along with that, like degenerative myelopathy, we can go into that another day too, because that's a pretty big deal, actually attacks the spinal cord, and you'll start to see a lot of incontinence and lack of bowel and bladder control with something like that too. So there's a lot of different reasons that you can experience this incontinence with your pets, but I'm going to focus on that which is caused by just straight up fixation in the sacrum, and why that would cause you to have some incontinence and constipation issues. So kind of like what we talked about a couple weeks ago with that rest and digest and your sympathetics and your parasympathetics when it comes to your nervous system, both of these things are involved with bowel and bladder control. So you've got both lumbar, which is your low back, and your sacrum, which is that tailbone that we just talked about. Both of those areas involved have peripheral nerves coming out of them, which are the nerves that communicate with organs and limbs and that sort of thing. Those nerves are involved in both sets of segments, basically. So you've got both rest and digest and fight or flight involved in bowel and bladder control, which I think is super important to realize, because when you think about it, if you've ever been scared or gotten into that fight or flight response, so that's involving your lumbars, right? If your body's going into this like adrenaline soaked, ready to go mode, the last thing you need to be worried about is having to go tinkle. So basically your sympathetics kick in and they'll, contract so that you're not going to have to do anything like that. Whereas the opposite with that, when you're talking about the sacrum, the nerves coming out of that are all going to be parasympathetic, which is more that rest and digest. So when those are activated, it oftentimes allows you to relax so you can use the restroom. So they're involved with both, but it's important to realize that you have both of those actions that are part of this whole system controlling your bowel and bladder. So what we need to look at is the lumbar region is very easily injured. It's like the most common place when we have dogs coming in with disc issues. That's usually where they're popping up. It makes perfect sense. They live their whole lives. They're very active. They run into walls. They somersault. They play with other dogs. And that lumbar region is your sturdy stabilizer region, but it's also mobile. So when you take a lot of hits to that area, it can cause arthritis, it can cause disc bulges, it can cause any number of things. And that's going to put pressure on your spinal cord and obviously those nerves coming out of that region. So you can see how any kind of damage to those lumbars can actually affect you where you are constipated, because they're not moving properly. So the signals are either overactive and not allowing your body to release, or they're underactive and you're not able to hold it in. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. Same can be said with your sacrum. So your sacral area houses both your sacral nerves and like your pelvic nerves. So there's a it's called the sacral plexus, but it's a big webbing of nerves that come out that mainly go to pelvic organs, hind limb musculature, and anything within your pelvis, like your bowel and bladder, that sort of thing. So the main one we want to talk about is called the pudendal nerve, which is actually a super fun word to say. So it's really specific. This one particular nerve is involved in both the urethra and the anal sphincters contracting and relaxing. So it basically helps you hold it. If you've ever thought of like when you're on a road trip and you really need to go to the bathroom, but you don't want to get off at that exit, you want to wait till you get home because you're determined not to have to pull over at a gas station. That nerve is what's helping you hold your bowel and your bladder. Same for your animals. It's just more of, it's a combination of both voluntary and involuntary. So that's helping them when you're potty training. They're not really recognizing that, right? They're just going to go when they want to go. Well, once they start realizing and getting trained properly, that pudendal nerve is what's helping them hold it, let you know they have to go potty, and then they go out and they're able to release it. A lot of times when we see dogs that are being bred, this can actually be injured pretty easily. And I think that's just because with those females, being pregnant in itself is very difficult on an animal, but especially if they're being bred repetitively, that can cause some long-term damage to those sacral nerves and the pelvic nerves as well. So a lot of times we've had people bring in animals that have been rescued that have been bred before, or they've got an older female that has been bred multiple times and they just want to get her checked out. And 99% of the time, that area in her pelvis is pretty out of whack. So we see a lot of that. Another thing that we need to talk about is in the sacrum, you've got both the pudendal and those pelvic nerves. So when those are coming out, those tend to go more towards your pelvic organs and your back legs. So not going to have as much of an effect as the pudendal does, but still involved nonetheless. But all of these nerves are super easy to damage. I mean, like we were just talking about, if you've got a dog that loves to jump up, like little dogs, when they come to see you and they just want to get near your face and they're super excited and, they fall on their back, they fall on their low back, or they fall on their butt, like any of those sorts of things can really have long-term effects on that tailbone and that pelvis. So our job is to make sure that we help keep those things moving, because while it may not be affecting them when they're younger, again, if it's happening year after year after year, and it's the hundreds of times they've fallen on that tailbone, you can see why as they age and they start to get arthritic in those regions, why you might have some issues with incontinence or constipation. So chiropractic can be super helpful with both of these things. We've seen kind of it run the gamut. We've worked on dogs with spay incontinence that have done really, really well, because a lot of times, like I said, it really can come from just the positioning of the procedure. Same thing with breeding dogs, very similar as the spay incontinence. It's easy to tell if it's going to help, because it's one of those things where if it's not a structural issue, if it's not being caused by a locked up sacrum, then you're not going to get any change. Like we've talked about before, when it comes to chiropractic, there's no placebo effect. You're either going to see improvement or you're not. And when you have a dog that's incontinent, it's very obvious whether or not you're getting change. It's not like you're not sure if they're in pain anymore or they're not. They're either leaking or losing their bowel or they're not. So we've had a lot of dogs come in that have been diagnosed with spay incontinence, and it's been completely resolved because it actually was more of a structural issue than not, which is great, because then these pets can get off of these medications that long-term can be really rough on them. The same thing can be said. We see a ton of elderly dogs that start to have this issue. Now, I want to make it super clear that it is not uncommon for dogs that are in their teens or dogs that are, nearing those real senior years of life to start having issues with their bowels, where they will lose control when they're in a deep sleep. They will, and they have no idea, or you'll have a little bit of a poop come out when they're trying to exert themselves to stand up. Those sorts of things are really, really common. You're not alone in that. What I will say is that chiropractic can oftentimes help prolong how long you have before that becomes an everyday occurrence. However, if that's from arthritis, or if that's from some kind of long-term damage to those nerves, eventually it will probably become an everyday thing. And as much as we would like to say we can fix that, we can help, but it won't necessarily fix it. It'll just give you a little bit more time before you have messes every day. And usually with elderly dogs, it tends to be bowel that they have trouble with more than urine. They tend to be able to control that for a little bit longer than they are able to control their bowels. So not quite sure why it works that way, but it's pretty typical that that's what we see. Or we'll also notice where dogs will, it's almost like they'll pop up real quick and run to the door, but they're too late. So what we think is happening is, if you think about it, your lumbars and your sacrum are at the very end of your spine, right? Well, all the messages are coming from your brain. So totally polar opposite area. Those messages have to go through an entire highway of your spine to get to your back end. So there's a lot of areas that can act as roadblocks along the way to kind of slow down that message, especially in an older animal or in an animal that has a lot of, fixations along the way. So through chiropractic, we can at least help make sure that mode of communication is as clear as possible. So that way, when they're trying to communicate with their back end, the messages are getting there as fast as possible, as opposed to kind of getting delayed along the way. So that's something that we can help as well, or at least rule out as a contributory factor. And I would say another big thing with the constipation is we actually do see quite a few constipated dogs and cats. It's obviously they're two like polar opposites, yet they're both it's all interrelated. It's all the same thing. You just kind of have different manifestations with different animals. So with constipation, we do tend to see that in all ages. It's not just senior dogs or cats. It's kind of runs the gamut. And I think a lot of times that constipation tends to be more of an early symptom of issues in their sacrum and their lumbars, as opposed to years and years and years down the road when they start to have that incontinence. So sometimes I kind of look at it as a blessing in disguise, because if we can address that sooner than later, then hopefully you won't have these long-term issues. But we have a lot of animals that come in strictly because they're blocked up and they've tried everything. Sometimes these pets have been on enemas, sometimes they've been on medication, you name it, they've probably tried everything, and their chiropractic is oftentimes like a last shot to see if it will help. And Jill can attest to this. I can't tell you how many of these animals have either pooped like immediately in the consult room, or on the way out through the store, or right in front of the store. So it's super, super common. And it's another one of those things, again, where whether or not people believe in chiropractic, it doesn't really matter, because there is no placebo effect. If you walk in with an animal that hasn't gone to the bathroom in an extended period of time and they get adjusted and within an hour or two they go to the bathroom, that's huge. That's telling in and of itself, because you're activating those parasympathetics. You're allowing the body to release and relax a little bit. So it's huge, and it makes a big difference, because constipation can be super painful. Like we've had pets come in before where people thought their dogs or their cats were, dying because they're screaming in pain. And then when you really start to examine them, you notice how hard their bellies are. And when you really start to examine it, you find out, well, they really haven't gone to the bathroom, or they're not really eating, or they are eating and still nothing's coming out. So just think about it. It's like shoving more stuff into a trash can that's full and you haven't emptied it. Like it's just going to start overflowing. So that's really important to kind of think about when you have a pet that suddenly there's a change in personality or a change in the way they're eating. You have to think, have they gone to the bathroom? Because that's a big deal. And there's a lot that we can do, both with chiropractic, with massage at home. It's very easy to start getting that process going with their intestines and helping things move. You just have to be on top of it and aware of it. And sometimes when folks have multiple animals, it's hard to tell. You're not necessarily sure, especially if you have a household with multiple cats, a household with multiple dogs, they're sharing litter boxes or whatever. You may not know who's going potty and who's not. And it's one of those things where I will say with constipated cats, a lot of times you'll notice them really biting at their back end or really licking it. And a lot of times dogs will do the same. Well, they'll lick their bum, just because it's their way of trying to like initiate that response for it to either contract or release. And sometimes it works, but you'll notice it too if they do start to go to the bathroom. I mean, they're usually very hard little like rabbit pellet poops. You know, they're not consistent with the norm. So the nice thing with constipation, there's a ton you can do, like food wise, supplement wise, to usually have a pretty fast acting response, like pumpkin, sweet potato, all those good things. Goat's milk is huge. That's really helpful as well. So those are really great for constipated animals because it helps soothe the gut, but it also helps initiate getting that mess out, you know. And people laugh because when we have animals that come in with diarrhea too, we're often like, well, have you tried pumpkin? Sorry guys, there's a dog walking by. But sweet potato and pumpkin kind of act as your buy one get one. It works for both situations, which is really cool. Slinky, go see your dad. So we've got that can always help with constipated animals. I'm always happy to show people ways to really rub the belly and the tummy to help initiate that as well. And dehydration is huge with that as well. You really need to make sure your pet is drinking to help keep things moving. But yeah, there's a lot of things that can be done for that. When it comes to incontinence, there's definitely things you can do. It's just a little bit less of that generalized advice, and it has to be a lot of times a little bit more pinpoint when it comes to what's going on with your pet. So what we always tell people that have issues with incontinence is it's really important to make sure your pet isn't getting way too much exercise, especially this is for the older dogs, because when you exhaust those muscles, they're going to have a very difficult time controlling their bowel and bladder. So exercise is good. Don't get me wrong. We love exercise. We just don't want you to exercise your 14-year-old dog like they're 5. So there's a healthy balance there that you kind of have to find for your animal. Another thing that's really helpful with incontinent animals is, and a lot of you guys know this about us, but we're big proponents of raw feeding, obviously. But even if you're not a raw feeder, you can always supplement the diet with some really, really good organ meat. And it sounds silly, but and Jill can attest this, that a lot of times when you have issues with specific organs, it's very helpful for them to eat organ meat of another animal. They're carnivores, they're omnivores, you know, they're going to eat that way. So with incontinence, it can be really helpful if they're eating like pelvic organ meat of other animals. That can be a huge helpful thing to do. If you're not quite down for that, there's a lot you can do homeopathically for them, and Jill can add on to that. There's a lot with chiropractic. Obviously, acupuncture can be super helpful. Massage can be very helpful, but you really want to make sure you have a diet that's sufficient in protein and fat. Like you need a very healthy, well-rounded diet, so that way that nervous system is getting bathed in all the good stuff. So that way it's working and communicating well. Collagen, again, is my favorite. So you can do collagen. That's very helpful at making sure everything's moving and grooving. And, you know, bone broth, also very helpful. All of these things are great sources of making sure your pet has a really balanced diet to kind of rule out that being the reason that they're having incontinence or constipation issues. So I think that's the hardest part when it comes to sacral and pelvic health, is narrowing down what you're really working with. And it's nice because, again, with chiropractic, if it's something that we can help, you'll know very quickly, you know, and we'll at least be able to rule out if it's something structural or if it's something more dietary related or if it's something more permanent. You know, you just are able to kind of figure out by process of elimination what you're working with. But it's really awesome. And then in all reality, if you just have that old pet that has accidents sometimes, I mean, sometimes that happens. It happens to humans. Like sometimes you laugh a little bit too hard and you tinkle. It just happens. And you need to accept that and be okay with it, because they've been there for years and years. And if they start to have accidents, that doesn't mean, you know, we don't yell at them. We love them. It's okay. And that's why they make doggy diapers and, you know, disposable potty pads that you can put on their bed while they sleep. So that way they can, if they have an accident, it's an easy cleanup in the morning, you know. Obviously we like a good diet so that your pet's not having diarrhea. That's very difficult to work with if they're having accidents all the time. But, you know, it's important to realize with most of these things, it's not a painful thing. So it's very hard to, they can be totally healthy otherwise. And this is just a normal process of aging. And as pet owners, I think it's really important that we recognize that and appreciate what they've done for us throughout their lives and support them while they go through that station of their lives. You know, it's not, we had a cat that had incontinent issues for like the last 2 years of his life, but otherwise he was entirely healthy. And we weren't willing to say goodbye just because he was having like urinary accidents every now and again. It just isn't, we weren't willing to do that. He was otherwise like the picture of health. So it's one of those things where you just have to do your best to support them. But if you really want to keep things clean, they do. They make diapers. You guys sell them. It's awesome. They make washable things. So that way you're not blowing through cash on the disposable potty pads.
Totally.
There's so many options for these pets. And, you know, I did have one client once who would withhold water for a while. And I would say, please don't do that. We want our pets to be able to drink. I mean, there's nothing wrong with taking it up before you go to bed so you don't have like this excessive thirst throughout the night. But most of the time, they're pretty good about knowing what they need and that sort of thing. So there's a lot of options for these animals. Sometimes it just takes a bit more effort on our part, whether that means getting them out a couple more times a day or hiring a dog walker that can get them out in the day while you're at work. You know, it's one of those things where it's a learning experience, but it's easy to manage. And at least with chiropractic and that sort of thing, we can narrow it down and hopefully prolong something before it becomes, you know, a more permanent fixture. So yeah, that's kind of where I would go. And I'll let Jill take it away a little bit with some of the supplement recommendations, because I know you guys have a lot of it.
Yeah. So just even speaking from my own experience too, we had a husky at 6 years old that started displaying incontinence, and she was sneaky. Everything my husky did was sneaky. So she would clean up after herself. So it took me quite some time to realize that she was actually having incontinence issues before I could pinpoint out of all of my dogs who was having the problem and what was going on. And then as she got older, it was interesting because the incontinence at a young age was just here and there wasn't like a rhyme or reason to it. But as she got older, I had always noticed it would be right after she fell asleep. So there's sometimes like as a caregiver, you can pay attention to when those things happen, because sometimes that leads us to different homeopathic remedies. Homeopathic remedies can be very specific as to when something happens and how it happens. And if there's any like if the pet notices it at all, or are they completely oblivious? So those little nuances can be important. With kitties, I would also watch too if you're finding urine or stool outside of the box. Sometimes it's a litter box issue, or it's an issue of them being ambushed in the litter box. But if you're finding things outside, or I know my one cat Viper, if something's going on, he'll actually go around to like different corners of the house, even where there's never been a litter box, but it's secluded and it's private, and he's straining as if he's constipated to try and get stool out. So with kitties, sometimes they can be more, they tend to hide things easier. They don't want everybody else to know about it. And if an owner has a litter box in the basement, it's even harder then to pay attention sometimes to what cat is going downstairs and using it. Some cats are vocal. I actually, out of all of our cats, we know even habits, like who covers and who doesn't, and kind of what boxes they use and what boxes they avoid. So just being in tune a little bit more with your kitties can sometimes steer you as to what's going on with who and how and all that jazz. So as for supplements, there's a couple supplements that kind of are knee-jerk. We recommend them all the time. Our number one cell salt, calc fluor. So that actually helps with elasticity issues. So if you have the incontinence or the both urinary or bowel, like Dr. Cole had mentioned about the sphincter muscles, that will actually help tighten the elasticity within those muscles. So sometimes it's just age and the elasticity isn't there anymore. It's just like you were saying with humans, you know, you cough or you sneeze or you laugh, and sometimes things happen. So that can be really helpful. Corn silk is an American herb that we often use for incontinence issues as well. And when my husky was on it, there were some days that we went probably above the recommended amount, just because we had to get her back on board. She'd have like 3 or 4 really bad days. So we would get her on corn silk, get an adjustment in, and increase our #1 salt calc floor. And then once she tapered, we would taper all of the supplements with it. So it was kind of like an ebb and flow, and we just had to pay a little bit more attention as to what was going on. Absolutely. I'm totally all about either diapers or reusable pads, things that you can wash, things that you can lay over top of dog beds. It just helps with the stress and the management of, yeah, you have to wash those, but that's a lot easier than washing like an entire dog bed or starting over or washing all the sheets. So those can really be kind of like a mental lifesaver, more or less. I've had senior dogs. We had senior dogs for about 8 years, so we had like a geriatric theme going on. So I understand like the stress sometimes that comes with it, but a lot of times cats and dogs, like Dr. Cole was saying, it doesn't really bother them. It's more or less a little bit more work on our end to keep up with the maintenance that goes with it. Constipation is treated a little bit differently than incontinence. So a lot of times it goes back to diet. It goes back to what are we dealing with the intestines? Are we dealing with like peristalsis issues? You know, is there the peristalsis not working? Is it more or less paralyzed? Do we not have enough fats? So you got to lube the tube, as we say in the natural health world. You gotta make sure that the dryness of the stool is not getting stuck. So you need some fats to help push it out. There are some supplements as well. There's cell salts, there's homeopathics. Cats, of course, are different and unique creatures. So we sometimes need to play along with what they're willing to do for us and how we add those supplements in. Because, of course, if you do a supplement and then your cat doesn't eat the food, well, it's kind of pointless. So we, sometimes need to figure out how to manage that so they're still eating consistently for you. Backing up to diet a little bit here too, the one thing that I appreciate about a raw diet, especially with incontinent animals, and cats, is that they're getting actually a lot of their moisture from their food. Mm-hmm. So they're not gulping down a whole bowl of water. So, and we see that a lot of times with high carb foods or foods that have a lot of salt or sugar in them, is that it makes your pet thirsty. So think about eating a dry bowl of Cheerios every morning. We put milk in it for a reason. Yeah, because we're trying to do something about the dryness that's there. Mm-hmm. So could you eat dry Cheerios? Yes, but you're probably going to drink some water afterwards. Mm-hmm. And if you do that day after day after day after day, eventually you're going to be like, your whole system's going to be dehydrated. And many times we notice cats and dogs that have ate only dry food for an extended period of time often are chronically dehydrated. And that's when we see the kidney problems come up and the urinary issues. And there's some other things that go along with that, digestive problems, constipation. So I think I would have been in a totally different situation had my husky been eating dry food and then gulping water down on top of it. I think our incontinence issues would have been exacerbated and worse because she was getting so much moisture from her diet being raw fed. So that's always something to think about too. Like if we can incorporate moisture from canned food or raw diet, goat's milk, bone broth, something that also has nutritional value to it, we're not going to see that water, that bowl chomping that some dogs do. I mean, I would expect it on a hot day like today, but it shouldn't be an everyday occurrence after their meal. So that can make a big difference in both of those issues. As well as making sure, I agree with even with animals that have given birth. Kayanga, our one cat, had 2 litters of kittens before she was retired. And that was the first thing I did when I got her, is I took her in for some chiropractic care because I knew that her back end probably needed the support. Even though she was a young cat, she was only 3 when I got her, she still needed that support. I mean, there's even babies that, within a week of from birth are already seeing a chiropractor to help with the spine, and things that may have happened through the birth canal. So it's at any age, incontinence or constipation can be an issue. Yeah. At any age, you can make improvements to the diet. and support them. At any age, you can do chiropractic care. So I think those are all great things. There's more supplements that help with incontinence. Corn silk and number one cell salt calc-fluor are my like go-tos, but we can always look at it from a perspective of when is it happening? How often is it happening? I had a client who had a dog that probably had the nerve nicked during the spay process, and at 2 years old would literally soak several diapers a day. And we made some supplements. We did a consultation, made some supplement suggestions, had some chiropractic done. And I mean, the dog was on like every pharmaceutical that you could think of, from estrogen pills to Proin to you name it, they've tried it. And our supplement suggestions were the only thing that actually slowed down the urine leakage they were dealing with. So lots of ways to try to improve everyone's life in the house, both your pets and yourself, because I get it. It can be stressful, but you can do some things to make it better. So yeah. All right. So anything you think I forgot?
I think you hit it.
Good. I'm sure there's more. I'm sure there's other things that will come to me, but so let's talk about chiropractic appointments. So both yourself and Dr. Tully have appointments at our store. So why don't you tell us about those?
Sure. So our initial exam and adjustment is between 20 and 30 minutes long, and we do a full history, a gait examination, a full palpatory exam, and then they get adjusted as well. The follow-ups are the exact same, except we just don't need to take a history. Obviously, we already have it. So those tend to be only between 10 and 15 minutes. The initial run's $90 and follow-ups are $55. And to schedule, it's super easy. If it's after hours, you can always go on thepetbistro.com and scroll down. There's a book an appointment tab, and you can pick either myself or Dr. Grant to make an appointment with. We are at the store at least 3 days a week, sometimes 4, sometimes 5. It just kind of depends on the week. So it's hard to miss us. Or if you're having trouble navigating that, you can always call 248-548-3448 at the store, and they can always book you guys out, no problemo.
Yeah, absolutely. And if anybody has additional questions, obviously you guys can reach out to Advanced Animal Chiropractic. I think pretty much everybody who's currently working at the store has had an animal adjusted.
Yeah.
In some way, shape, or form. So I know, and it's nice to have, we have both, you and Dr. Tully. So if your animal has its nuances about male or female, we have one of each. Times, we have Tuesday evening, Wednesday morning, Thursday afternoon, and the second or third Saturday of every month, depending on the month. Sometimes we have additional added hours on Friday. So there's always days that we can get you in. And most often, if you feel like chiropractic is something that's going to help, or you have the week off, or an injury happened, a trauma happened, and you want to get in as soon as possible, we can typically get you in to see one of the chiropractors same week. So there's lots of open availability, although they do tend to fill up, but we can usually get you in. So awesome. We don't have any questions tonight. We must have been thorough enough, but I'm sure something might come up. If you guys think of any questions, let us know. Write it in the comments. We'll swing back around and make sure we answer them. Next Monday night, we'll be here again with another Chiro chat. We'll have to talk about our topic for next week.
We'll figure it out.
Yeah, if anybody has any ideas, let us know. Let us know in the comments if you have a topic that you would like us to talk about. But we'll just keep venturing up the spine here and talking about all the different ways that chiropractic can help a cat or dog or horse or whatever other animal that has a spine, right?
Yeah, any of those.
And we'll keep chatting about chiropractic care with your pet. So cool. I'm so glad you could join us tonight, Dr. Cole. Thank you for all your information. And I know incontinence and constipation doesn't sound like an exciting topic, but it is when it's happening in your house. It is exciting, and everyone wants to know about it.
True.
All right. Have a great evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us.